Assalamu alaikum and welcome to MAXCast. My name is Syed Raza. I am your host in Toronto, Canada. And today on the podcast, we have Hassam Munir. He calls himself the brofessor of Islamic history. He aspires to make knowledge of Islamic history more accessible to the general public. And for the past 6 years, Hassam has been sharing Islamic knowledge through blogs, op-eds, presentations, guided tours, exhibits, and social media, to the extent that in 2017, he was recognized by Heritage Toronto as one of the city's emerging historians. He is a public relations manager and research fellow at Yaqeen Institute of Islamic Research and has experience in journalism and public relations. Without any further ado, Hassam Munir.
Walaikum salam, Syed. I'm doing well, alhamdulillah. Thank you so much for having me in this conversation. I'm really excited.
I'm really excited as well. You can probably hear it in my voice. I have a bunch of things to ask you, but I wanted to ask you first off, Professor of Islamic History. I think you are possibly the first person to have this title. Can you tell me a little bit about this title and how this came to be?
I was just talking to a friend very randomly. This was a few years ago now. Just having a conversation about what friends talk about. And he said, I think we should call you the brofessor of Islamic history because you're not actually a professor, but you act like one, right? You're in the fake it till you make it kind of stage in the long journey of academia. So he said, but you kind of give off that vibe. So why not let's call you the brofessor of Islamic history until we can call you something else.
Well, mashallah, man. I mean, I will say we all need professors and people that are learned at a very high level, but sometimes you do need somebody who can distill it for you in a way that makes perfect sense. So that's the main reason I'm really excited to talk to you. I became first aware of you through Instagram. I was following you for a few months, actually, and I was like, wow. For me, it was about reconciling my Canadian identity. I moved here from Houston, Texas, and looking at your page, not only was it a lot of really good stuff about Muslims in North America, but also in Canada, and I learned about a lot of Canadian stuff, and I was really happy to hear that. But let's kind of start off from the top. I'd love to know your journey a little bit. How did you get involved with history? Was it something that you've always aspired for or developed over time? Tell me a little bit.
It's always an interesting question, and you would think that as someone who's in the field of history, I would know by now, like, where to mark the starting point of any particular story, but it's not the case. It's always a challenge, and that includes my own. Like, at what point did I really start to, be serious about pursuing this as a field? I know I had an interest for a long time. Like, I can remember as early as like third grade or fourth grade, just being like, learning about like the pioneers in the Canadian education system here coming up, and learning about medieval times. And then I remember a particular moment in sixth grade where in the social studies textbook, there was one paragraph about Muslims in Spain. And like, I think I was like, we have those desk buddies and everyone. And I was just like annoying the person sitting beside me, pointing out that, hey, like, Muslims were in Spain, like, a few hundred years. And look, it says so in the textbook, but one paragraph, right? So really for me, I think, on a more serious note, like in retrospect, growing up in this kind of post 9/11 environment, for lack of a better term, but I think that illustrates that era well, in the 2000s. It was always a very interesting galaxy of questions, like kind of going around in my mind. Like, you see the, portrayal of Islam in the media, and then you see something in the mosque, and then you see how your parents teach you and what they themselves practice at home. And there's so many different Islams, right, in your mind. And sometimes they don't reconcile very well. So I did have these questions, like, why is the Muslim world or many of the Muslim majority countries, like, why are they in this kind of state where they're not as, forward thinking, let's say, generally, as other parts of the world? And looking back at it now, or saying it now is kind of like, okay, this is not an appropriate question to ask in the first place, right? Because there's a history of colonialism and very complicated, backstory. But at the time I was very young, and I think young people have these questions in their minds. And so for me, history became this kind of external reference point, right? You love reading stories. and you start to realize that there are certain types of stories that are prevalent in the time and in the place that you live. But at the same time, there's many other stories in human history. There's so many cultures. There's so many people who did so many different things. And that's how I really started to get into stories, I would say, before history in the past, right? And starting especially with the story of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So what became the kind of so ultimately, like I said, trying to navigate through these competing kind of visions of Islam. One thing that was clear was that obviously no one could be a better Muslim than the Prophet of Islam, right? So ultimately, he and his life and what he did would define what Islam is and what Islamic societies are supposed to look like. So that's what I turned to when I started studying the life of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And then that, I think, kind of inculcated, and this is in my early teenage years, it started to kind of inculcate like like when you're watching like a Netflix series or something like that, and sometimes the show isn't even that good, although the life of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was incredible. But I'm saying like sometimes the show or something that you're watching isn't even good, but when the new season comes out, they're still like, oh, like I gotta know like how this thing ends, like we gotta keep this going somehow. So you start watching that too, right? And that's how you get through like, I don't know, 500 episodes of Earth of World or something like that, right? But so that's basically like how I think going from a natural curiosity at a young age to a more serious search for answers and trying to figure out, like, me as a Muslim, what am I supposed to be doing? What is my identity? What is my story? What's the larger story that I'm part of? Because I got kind of, I guess, suspicious of a lot of the stories that were told both within the Muslim community, and not just told like, verbally, but the way people behave, right? And so I turned back to the original story to see what is Islam supposed to be like, and that's how it started.
That's beautiful, mashallah. What do you think it is in your journey that, in your teens, having this interest and this passion to learn about something and making it more into of a non-traditional career? Like, when did that switch happen in your head? I would love to kind of know, you're like, oh, wow, I might want to do this full time. Give me an idea of when that kind of started peeking into your brain.
It's a work in progress still, to be honest, right? And I think that's the story with most careers. I mean, we know about like, career changes at different stages in life, and people's interests change, etc. I think really I was in maybe second or third year of university, right? So I had originally gone into university at York University in Toronto studying communication studies, right? And I had a broad range of interests. So I was in communication studies. I was working as an editor at the student newspaper. So I was kind of like, dabbling in journalism a little bit. I was taking like marketing courses, and I was trying to do a lot of sports journalism. I was really trying to find my way, which is, I think, the story of a lot of people at that age who haven't opted for a career where a lot of the guidelines are set for you, right? This was sort of like okay, do whatever you want kind of situation, but you're also responsible, and you're also, required to make the best of the opportunities that you have at your disposal, which is what my parents told me, by the way. And alhamdulillah. And yeah, really, I think it was its second or third year of university. And the way it came about, to be honest, was having access to university resources. Not, classes were part of it. So I'm really grateful for a few courses that I took at York University. And there's certain challenges, of course, in studying Islam through academia. Maybe we can touch on those later, etc. But really having access to resources in general, and then having access to so many young people also trying to find their way, and having kind of respectful, fruitful conversations with others and peoples of many different understandings. And then more important than anything, spending a lot of time in the library, right? Like a lot of time in the library, kind of sleeping there, eating there, even though that's not allowed, but even there sometimes. And just going through books and trying to learn about Islam and different cultures and stuff like that. And then at some point, I think around my third year of university, I started to have this realization that not necessarily that I wanted to pursue this as a career, but that I had to make some kind of serious, organized effort to get this information out to the world, right? Like there were like these dusty textbooks that you would open, right? That nobody is ever going to open apart from a few history students. But when I read that stuff, I'm like, everybody enjoys a story, and this is a story that people would find inspiration in, that they would find role models in, that they would find lessons in that we can all apply in our lives, and this stuff needs to get out there. So that's when I started to become serious about it. And then really after graduation, after I got into the humanitarian field and started working with Islamic Relief and other organizations, that I decided that I was going to pursue it sort of as a career as well. And I started to pursue my master's, which is what I'm still doing.
Marshall, okay, so I have a question for you. So once you started, your first steps of learning more about it, you're in university, it's not even prescribed, it's your own need to learn that is driving you, and you start learning those things, you start sharing those things. What were those first few interactions where you learned something and you shared it? Did you find like people were very positive and were like, well, thank you for sharing that, I didn't know about it, or what was that like?
So that's sort of a mixed reaction, of course. So here's the thing, like history and much of academia is it operates in sort of like the ivory tower, right? And historians are often speaking to other historians and history students and other experts, basically, right? Specialists in that field. And so this, became both a great opportunity and a real challenge for me very early on, that I was trying to bring almost like two worlds together, and translate academic knowledge and distill academic knowledge so that non-specialists and the general public could kind of comfortably consume it without having to like go get a history degree. Just as part of your daily life, you're slowly picking up on these pieces of information, and you're building your general understanding of Islamic history. So the first part of that was great in the sense that I started a blog. My blog is called iHistory. I started that when I was I think 18, in my first year of university, and just started like things I would read, and I would just kind of put it on the internet. It's like hopefully people will kind of come across this. I started a Facebook page to promote the blog, and slowly I did a little bit of push marketing, and it started to get some attention, and people were always generally very much amazed by what they were reading, because there's certain kind of understandings generally of what Islamic history is. Like, the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then for many people it stops there. And if people have really gone into it, then they might know like a few Muslim empires, the story of people like Salahuddin Ayyubi and stuff like that. But it really doesn't go like too far. So when I started blogging about things like, there was a Chinese prisoner of war in the city of Kufa in Iraq in like the 7th century, and like how did he describe the Muslims, right? What were the early Muslim scientists? Like, we always talk about scientific achievements, but you find these fascinating kind of things like they were researching, why do humans laugh, right? Why does ice float on water? Like things we just don't think about today because we know when we take them for granted, but there's this incredible kind of conversations and all of these records. So there was so much in history, culturally, especially like cultural history, that people were really like taken by that. And then I started getting contacted by like other blogs and sites like that, asking if they could republish articles, if I could write for them. And I took advantage of a lot of those opportunities. And then on the flip side of that, and this was a major challenge that I faced at that point, was that I would, I remember distinctly, I had a professor as a friend on Facebook. And I remember scrolling by and just seeing like my article from my blog. And when you see it, you stop and you're like, who shared this? So the professor had shared this, and I'm like, wow, this is so exciting. And then I look at it again, and there's like a caption, like a one-liner on it, and he had said something to the effect of like, I can't believe people write this nonsense, right? And this was something like, this was a person I had a huge amount of respect for, and I still do, right? And I still work with him in some capacity, although I've never told him this, and I've never told anyone his name, right? But So that was the challenge. Like I've had a lot of those instances where people feel the tension a little bit, especially within academia, because obviously when you're presenting to the general public, I mean, I'm not writing another 300-page book. I'm trying to take like 300-page books and fit them into one Instagram post. There's obviously going to be nuances and details and like, thousands of footnotes that I won't be able to include in like an Instagram post. So that's a tension sometimes, but generally for the general public, I think, they received it very well from the beginning, and they were very supportive, which is something I'm really appreciative of, and that's what's kept me going.
And did you do that on purpose, is go where the general public is, go to, yes, blog and social media, not necessarily go ahead and just, write articles for, let's say, those white towers to review and maybe get published one day? You kind of try to go right to the people. Was that intentional, or was that the only things that were kind of at your fingertips?
No, that was very intentional, right? Because the idea is to generate interest in history in general among the people. Because again, like growing up, what's the history that we're taught in Canada and in many other places around the world, there's a very nationalistic frame to it, right? Like it's almost like, I mean, without going too much into it, but it's like the purpose of teaching children history is to make them love their country. And once we feel like they love their country enough, okay, we're good, and then they can decide if they want to go into like university and study history there or something like that. But in the public school system, so that's what people come up with. You hear about like heroic achievements. You hear about, war efforts. You hear about nation building, how the country was built with pioneers and all of these things. And then, it really like people don't see themselves in that history, and people just don't, find it interesting, because what relevance does it often have to their day-to-day lives, right? Which is why I love to talk to people about like the history of coffee. Like I love starting there because that's like something that's part of many people's lives, right? Or food history, by the way, which is the fastest growing subfield of history. And I think particularly for this reason, people like those interesting kind of cultural tidbits. And so I was very purposely like, I'm not ashamed of saying this, like when you're trying to make your field more accessible, yes, I was writing clickbaity stuff, like, and making like clickbaity, kind of, headlines and stuff like that. Like I was trying to get them in, to get them reading, and then hopefully generate some interest so they could do further learning. And I've had a lot of that where people read they read an article and they say two things. I heard about this for the first time. Where can I learn more? And then I can guide them to like those resources, right? So
yeah, I have a lot more questions about exactly that, some of the content, but I wanted to ask you this as a little bit of a change. I know you were in university when you really started getting interested in this. What did you go to university for? And how was it when your parents were like, wait, are you trying to do this for a living? Like, how was that? Give me an idea. I'd love to know.
Yeah. So even before history, I had that conversation with my parents because I was graduating from high school and I said, I want to study communication studies at York University. Right. And they were, my parents have always been very sort of accommodating and encouraging in general of things like seeking knowledge. And I always had that inclination. And I think they kind of, that itself makes them a bit comfortable. Right. When I come to them with a decision, because they have some idea that, okay, this guy's probably thought it through at least a little bit. But what they told me when I went to my parents to tell them about communication studies is that, look, like they were like, this is a career that we don't understand, right? And I often think about what they were really trying to say. Like, are you trying to dissuade me, right? What's going on? They're like, this is a career that we ourselves don't really understand. If you feel that this is something that's right for you or something you want to pursue, then you should go for it. But then you are, make sure that you don't forget that you have these responsibilities towards your family, your existing family, and the family that you'll one day start. You have responsibilities towards your community, right? You have to become financially stable. Like they were kind of, and I really appreciate their approach that they took was that they were teaching me how to think rather than what to think, right? And we say this often, but I really appreciate that my parents actually did it. And it really did make me think about a lot of things. They weren't discouraging per se in any way. which may not be everyone's experience, right? And if anyone's listening, and if you do face some kind of discouragement, just keep in mind that, and obviously there's so many factors and so many different situations that I don't want to offer like the blanket solution or like this is the go-to thing, but like, there's a saying that build it and they will come, right? There's always a lot of people who may have doubts, who may not understand what you're trying to do as well as you do, right? And all of these things, but that just means that, like I, in my case, have to work that much harder to show them the benefit of this, right? I made a decision, and then I worked really, really hard to, get to a point where now they're like, okay, like he's done something for himself and it's benefiting others as well, and he's going somewhere, right? So they're very comfortable now. So and obviously in every situation we ask for Allah's help and guidance. But yeah, and then going into history as well, I think by the time I was in third year university, they had become a bit more comfortable. And then the masters, when I was applying for my masters, that was another kind of okay, let's rethink this situation. But again, like you have to, if you believe in something, right, and if you're willing to put in the effort to really do your absolute best, right, and you can sincerely say that to yourself, then it makes it easier to convince others as well, particularly through your work. And at some point, your work will start to speak for itself. So yeah, I think that's like something to keep in mind, like just food for thought for anyone who's going through this kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to hear as a daughter, as a son, or as a father or a mother. No, definitely. And then tell me a bit, having this perspective now, what is your philosophy or objective with your work? What do you aspire to do at this point? Tell us a bit more.
I think one of the main purposes of studying history, and like I said, I started as using it as an external reference point from the situation that I lived in, and looking at other people's lives in different times and places and seeing how did they live life and how did they try to excel and what can I learn from that. So that's part of it, right? But I think a big part of it is just learning to appreciate the human experience, right? What I mean by that is that history teaches us that people are a product of their circumstances, right? And that's a key lesson, I think, to keep in mind when we're looking at the challenges we face in our societies today. I mean, we kind of repeat phrases like history repeats itself and that sort of thing. There's conversation about how accurate that is, but that's just an endless conversation because it's going to, you could argue either way, and there's strong arguments either way, and there will be. But when you start to get a bit more specifically into like, okay, what exactly do we mean by that, right? And in my understanding, it's like history is a sort of subject that reminds us that people are a product of their circumstances. So if you want to eliminate ignorance and hate in society in any form, whether it's like misogyny or racism, and any of these things, you have to first of all look at the trajectory of where did it come from, right? And then specifically within that trajectory, you have to understand that it's a product of a certain set of circumstances. So we never hate another human being. We hate the circumstances that made them behave in ways that we disagree with, and we think that they shouldn't be behaving that way. And so when we want to bring change in society, we're trying to change the circumstances and people will change themselves. So I think this is like a key kind of lesson that I'm trying to impart overall in all of the work that I do to show like the diversity of history. It's not a simple narrative, and to show that the more we learn about the human experience, I think the more richly this lesson will come out that, okay, we need to really stop looking at other people like another human being, another person, and essentializing them and saying like, oh, they're just like that, or he's just like that, right? Like they are like that for a reason, and we will give them different reasons to be a different kind of person based on what we learned from history. So that's what drives me forward, and that's why I'm always looking for examples that kind of hopefully make people think about another person's life and another person's experience and try to make it very relatable to people. Like your life is not that different from like the coconut farmer in Indonesia, like 700 years ago, or I could pick any place in the world and a person who did anything, and everyone is just trying to live a good, happy, fulfilling life. Everyone's seeking happiness in some form, and some people may go in directions that we really don't agree with. But that being said, that only means that we have to, again, study history, learn how those circumstances came to be, and then change them in the present. So the future will be better, inshallah.
It's so refreshing to not only hear you say that, Hassam, but I was on your Instagram page and I saw that with baked into a lot of different historical context, there was also all of a sudden this shout for, I believe it was a little girl in Calgary who needed stem cells, and she was half Caucasian, half Filipino. And you guys posted that, this is a need we have in the community. And I just saw it so refreshing that I was 1 second in 1850 learning about this slave who came to Ottawa and then moved to Dakota. And then there was this story here. Is that something like I can tell now that is very done with purpose? Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if history does not inspire us to change, right? To change ourselves first and foremost, to seek out role models, to seek out people we can look up to who excelled in every aspect of life, and we can try to emulate them in our own times and in our own context. Then I mean, it's just a bunch of fun stories. And why would you, and I laugh, I joke around with my friends about this. I'm like, man, there's things I'd rather be doing, like me, right? Like there's things I'd rather be doing. Studying history, sharing history, it serves a very functional purpose, right? Like it's supposed to inspire. It's supposed to kind of get us moving and thinking in different directions than what we're used to. And hopefully, that comes out in the work that I do, that there's a clear link between the stories that I'm sharing and the kind of work that we have to do today.
Beautiful. No, Hassam, I still have a few more questions for you, and then I appreciate all the time you spent with us so far. It's been absolutely a pleasure on our first podcast. What is a story that you feel like it's inspired you the most, or a person that influenced you the most on your journey?
So there's been many people, right? And this is the beauty of studying history again, that you get to live like almost vicariously so many lives, right? You become so intimately familiar. Like I could tell you that I'm very inspired by Ibn Battuta, right? Like the famous traveler from the 14th century. And if you actually read his story in depth, not just the fact that he went to a lot of places, which I would love to do and I hope to do someday, inshallah. But the fact that he, in many different situations that were extremely difficult in those travels, he stuck to his principles, he stuck to his beliefs, right? He stood up for others. He tried to make things better in places like everywhere that he was going. So I could, go from there, and then obviously going back to the time, like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, like seeing the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as the prime role model, right? And then seeing the generations that were very close to him within time and immediately like inspired by him and inspired by his teachings. And then throughout history, people who have sort of followed that example right up until our present day. In terms of the field itself, I think it's very important to have role models, like whichever field that you're in. And especially if you're a Muslim, like a young Muslim professional in some field, I think it's helpful to seek out, among role models of all backgrounds and all faiths, and people who bring all kinds of different perspectives that can inform and enhance your own experience, but Muslim role models specifically within your field. So I'm very inspired by people like Dr. Abdullah Hakim Quick. He was one of the first people to get a PhD in history from the University of Toronto and complete traditional Islamic education at the University of Medina, and just the style of teaching that he's had. And we're blessed to have him in our community here in Toronto. And he's sort of been with us and in many parts of the world as well for the past 50 years, and just performing incredible service towards like teaching in a very diligent way, not like shove down your throat kind of history, right? Like it's like, oh yeah, like and not like a history that kind of, brings like people up and down in the sense that we're better than them, or they became better than us and destroyed us, and not like a confrontational kind of vision like that, but a community building vision, a vision that's rooted in like the shared human experience across all cultures and faiths, and all of these things. Dr. Abdullah Hakim Quick, Dr. Afua Cooper, Dr. Afua Cooper is a professor. She's Jamaican, Canadian, and Muslim, and she's a professor at Dalhousie University, and she's one of the leading scholars of Black history in Canada and Black studies across North America. And just the amount of what the inspiration I found in her is what I mentioned earlier, like the connection between studying history and what we do, and the way that she has studied history and used it to inform her activism, and continues to do so in many ways. And Dr. Shafiq Varani, who's a professor at the University of Toronto. Shout out, he's my supervisor for my thesis. I will get that done soon, Professor Varani, if you're listening to this. But he was actually one of the first people I found out at undergrad, and this really inspired me. And even the small things that you do, that people are like, what's going on here? You never know what kind of impact they have on somebody else. So he was the first person in Islamic studies, like, in academia, to release a book trailer, right? So we have movie trailers, but when he released one of his books on Islamic history, I remember he came up with a trailer, and my professor at York University at the time showed that to us. And I was just fascinated, not so much by the trailer itself, all due respect, Professor Virani, but really by the idea, like the kind of forward-thinking concept of how do we make this more accessible, right? And I have, the good fortune of now working with him very closely, and he has inspired me with so many ideas on how we can move this field forward. Maybe like 100 years from now, the traditional professor-student model won't be as efficient anymore. And there will be other ways of learning. And that's why I like to explore, like, can we teach Islamic history through video games or like virtual reality projects, right? Through movies and documentary series and virtual tours and all of these kinds of things, especially enabled by new digital technology. And he's been a huge part of that. And so many other people, like even Sheikh Umar Suleiman, I have to mention, with Yaqeen Institute, which I work with now, right? And I work with them because of the vision of, we are going to take, very rigid, and kind of difficult to read and process Islamic knowledge, and try to make it as accessible as possible through like infographics and animations, and translating it into different languages, and starting this whole effort that Yaqeen Institute does towards combating like Islamophobia and combating many forms of ignorance that exist within our world and within our own communities, particularly. So there's many different inspirations. I'm sorry for the long-winded answer, but I hope I'm getting the idea across.
Not at all.
This is because when I'm struggling, and we all have those moments when when like self-doubt, right? Like I have self-doubt kind of often, and I think people do in many fields. It's like, what am I doing? What, right? Like sometimes you have that moment. That's when you remember like others who have been in this work for so long, and they worked so hard to pave the way for you, and you can't just let it go. Like you have to keep going.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. And I can see somebody like yourself who has the perspective. You have good advice in terms of how to deal with self-doubt. Now, what if you are somebody who is, a young person, let's say in their, mid-teens, and they have a similar spark, they have similar interests? What advice would you give to them? Maybe that's somebody with not all the resources to be able to go to a university or something like that as of right now. What is some of the things that you have learned that you would like to tell somebody who's, on a similar path possibly and has a similar love for history?
I would tell them certainly to read regularly. And I know that sounds like, well, obviously, right? But it's something that we try, like I try, we start all the time. Sometimes we fall off, and we all have these like goals on like January 1st about how many books we're going to read in the year. And then on like December 25th or something like that, we're like, oh man, I only have 5 days left. So reading regularly, I think, and reading history books in particular. And that really what opens the way. Remember, I said, like, I used to spend many hours in the library, and probably still would be doing that if there wasn't COVID, right? But because as you read, you become exposed to other things that you can read about. And then it just becomes like a cycle of cumulative knowledge building, right? The other thing I would advise is, so keep reading as like a baseline. Like, you should be doing that. There are so many books on Islamic history, on even on like subtopics of Islamic history that you could just go on and on. Another thing I would really advise is to seek advice, right? To not sort of work in isolation and not try to move forward in isolation. Like, not all advice that you receive from others will be helpful, and not all advice is something that you will necessarily agree with. But it's always a good habit to have to, when you're initiating maybe a new project or you're trying to head in a different direction, like, try to think of all of the relevant people you know personally. Try to find online, like, people like myself. You can reach out to me on social media and that sort of thing. And there's many others. And sometimes you would be surprised. Like, you might think that like I will respond, inshallah, right? But even I've had these moments where reaching out to like senior professors, and you kind of have that, oh, should I really email this person? Like, why would they, bother? But they come back and they give you like very detailed feedback and a lot of, very helpful advice and these things. So don't neglect like those opportunities to seek advice. And really, there's so many different avenues that a person could take in this field that I think I'll limit my specific advice to those two things. That never stop seeking advice from others who are in the field, and others who are doing work that's even remotely related to what you're doing, and seeing the kind of work that others are doing and build those connections. And then definitely keep reading and keep expanding your horizons and make connections, right? Like, what does again, right, like somebody in Fiji, like a Muslim in Fiji, have to do with like the history of Islam in Canada, right? Like, think a bit creatively. Oftentimes we have this thing, it's like, well, history is what it is. Like, how can I think creatively? But it's all about piecing things together and bringing together, like, you can write the same story in many different ways and get many different lessons and many benefits out of it. And even if it's a story that you think has already been done to death and it's been written about by everyone, there's still something there that is left to be written, and maybe that's for you.
I'm so inspired by your desire and your curiosity to keep learning, and that's what you seem to implore to everybody: is learn from books, and if that's on top of that, learn from mentors, and then find greater mentors, learn from different cultures. And it seems to be around learning, not so much about what's right or wrong. It's like, keep exposing yourself and, use your guidance to figure out. I'm going to give you some time for the next one, because this whole time, the last, as long as we've been speaking, I know it kind of flies when you're having such engaging conversations. You've given a lot of advice. Our last question is always a big one. We want to give you a second to try to like form it all together. And what is the most important thing you've learned in your life? And I know it's a big question, especially with all the advice you've given us. But what would you say to sum it up, if you were to give us like a solid 2 minutes of what is the greatest thing you've learned? Or it takes a little bit longer, obviously, that's okay. We'd love to kind of end off with that. What is the most important thing you've learned in your journeys, Hassam Munir?
I think the most important thing that I've learned, and again, like you mentioned, it's a big question, right? But the most important thing is probably the need to be sincere, right? And sincerity is a word that's not very well defined, although it's used quite often, but it's not often very clear. But I always think back to one particular quote of Malcolm X, right, in which he said something to the effect of, I want to be remembered as someone who was sincere. Even when I was wrong, I was working with sincerity, right? And that's the thing, I think, in my field, in many other fields, like, we may make mistakes, we may misinterpret history, we may have blind spots that we're not aware of. Like, it's always a work in progress, and history is this enormous subject, right? And again, we're trying to draw on so many different times and places. In my particular work as a public historian, trying to make history more accessible, and not necessarily producing original research, but just repackaging content that's already been based on existing research. So there's going to be challenges. A lot of it's uncharted territory. And I'm not sure about all of the places that my work could lead to, right? And many great places. And it might help people in many ways. And it may also lead to places, and as we've seen in the past, like history has been abused, and it continues to be abused around the world today, in many parts of the world today. But the important thing is to ask yourself regularly, I think, am I being sincere? Like, am I sincere about this, right? And I think from sincerity, you get diligence, right? When you are a sincere person, that's when you will become more thoughtful. That's when you will become more diligent. That when you'll start having more like self-introspection, right? And those things are really the keys to success. I believe in any line of work, regardless of what it is. So I try to ask myself every day, like, am I doing this for the same reason that I started doing it on day one, when there wasn't, thousands of Instagram followers or like people reading your blog or something? Like, what initially made you get into this when there was no tangible benefit immediately available to it, right? And make sure that that initial intention of sincerity remains like kind of intact. And then from that, you'll get your due diligence. And then from that, you can move forward, hopefully in a very beneficial way for yourself and for others as well.
MashaAllah. Hassam Munir, the brofessor of Islamic history, public historian. Hassam, thank you so much for coming on today. I know that I'm fortunate to have you on Instagram, but where can people follow you? Where can they go and find your work?
So definitely on Instagram. So my Instagram is hassam.history. You can also follow me on Twitter, where I post less about history. I guess depends, but it's at Hassam M_. And on my blog. So my blog has been my project, right? The love of my life for the past I think 7 years now. And alhamdulillah, and it's been on and off, and you sometimes go to the blog and it's like, man, 7 years and this guy only has like this many articles up, right? So there's been times when I just didn't post for like months, and then like sometimes I post 3 articles in a day. Like it's a work in progress, but I think you'll find like a lot of interesting starting points, like especially if you're somebody out there and you're like, yeah, Islamic history, like I'm not sure where to start, right? Like I'm not even sure, like we don't know what we don't know kind of situation. So I think my blog, if you just kind of browse through it, you can find like a lot of interesting starting points for further, your knowledge journey within the field of Islamic history. So the blog is iHistory, and you can find it at www.ihistory.co. And I'm sorry to Apple for taking the iPhone kind of name and just making it iHistory. Like I said, I was trying to be very clickbaity back in the day, right? And .co, don't put .com, because I don't even know what that's going to take you to. But yeah, hopefully all those resources are helpful. But definitely, like even personally, please don't hesitate to get in touch, right? Like send me a message on Instagram or something like that, and I will do my best to reply, like regardless of what your question is.
And I will say this is, I'm really happy people like you exist. I honestly am. We do our best to learn from every resource that we can, but you make it so easy. So I would recommend to anybody who is interested, definitely go on the blog, go to the Instagram page, and the resources are out there and they're very engaging. So thank you so much once again, Hassam. I know you weren't feeling the bestest today, but you still powered through it. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum.